Welcome everybody to the Ambition Project Show. I'm your host, Deirdre Sanborn. The Ambition Project Show is a business podcast where I interview ambitious leaders who share their big ideas and personal experience about how they've overcome challenges to make a positive impact at work and in their communities. If you like what you hear on the show, subscribe to it on iTunes or on my website at www.theambitionprojectshow.com. Today I'm joined by Mark Sanborn, and no, unfortunately, he's not a relative. He is an international best-selling author of The Fred Factor and Fred 2.0, as well as his book Up, Down, or Sideways. He is a noted expert on leadership, team building, and change in the workplace. So Mark, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Great. Well, it's great to be on the show. And yes, I suppose if we went back far enough, we probably are related. We might have to go back several hundred years, though, to find out where our family trees branched.
Hey, well, we do look kind of similar, so I'll go with that.
You're much prettier than I am.
Aw, thanks. Well, I'm always very curious about how people moved into the career they're in. Is it a passion or a calling? And what does that stem from? So if you could tell me a little bit about maybe where you grew up, your childhood, and how you ended up where you are today.
Sure. Well, and I think there's a lesson or two for people who are listening that are leaders or entrepreneurs that will come out of my stroll down memory lane. I'll try to make it brief. I grew up on a farm in Northeast Ohio. I grew up on a dairy farm and was very involved in both 4-H and FFA. And those were two very instrumental organizations for what I have become today, because at a young age, I got involved in leadership activities and, importantly, public speaking. And my first contest as a 4-H member was at the age of 10 in a speaking contest. And I did so badly and was so humiliated that I threw everything I had into learning how to be a public speaker. And the reason that that's important is because I've come to believe these many years later that, we enjoy success, but we learn more from failure. And if we can find the lesson in the failure, then we can use that to catapult ourselves to great success. I think if I had done okay in my first speaking contest instead of bombing so badly, who knows, I might be an architect or an engineer or a lawyer or something different than I am today. But I decided that that was important to me, that I really wanted to figure out how to do that, to speak in public, to develop that confidence and those presentation skills. So it's been a lifelong journey that began at a very young age. And of course, what's interesting is that speaking, communicating is such an integral skill for leadership. It's not the only skill. I think we over-rely on this soundbite leadership approach today, where somebody looks good on TV or makes a good speech, we want to elect them, and that frankly is a frightening prospect. But I do think that if you have substance as a leader or as a person, but you can't communicate it well, then it doesn't serve you well. So those two things, leadership and communication, go together. And I was the national president of the FFA, Future Farmers of America, back during the Jurassic period. Later served as president of the National Speakers Association. So I've always been interested in leadership, not just as a subject, but really as a practitioner, and serving on boards of directors and community organizations. It's a skill set that I don't just talk about, but I use on a daily basis.
Right. I had a similar experience in terms of speaking, except mine was a little different. I was in Model UN in high school. And I had no prior experience, and they tell you, hey, here's debate. We're going to have this debate. You have 2 minutes to prepare yourself, get up there. Yeah. And I went up there, and it was so much fun. It was so exhilarating. And I'm like, hey, I want to do more of this. And to be honest with you, I didn't pick it up until just recently. But it's enjoyable. It's an enjoyable craft, art, if you will, if it's something that people are interested in, and certainly a valuable leadership skill.
Well, truth is transferable. I think people tend to forget that the same skills you learn to become a good golfer or skier, you can learn to become a better entrepreneur or parent. I think you look for the underlying lessons. My work is very principle-based. I look for principles that, and all principles by definition, do not change over time or culture or context. The principle always stays the same. Sometimes the application changes. And I like to talk about email. We haven't had email for 100 years. We've only had it for 20 years or 25 years. But the same principles that make for good communication when you speak to someone in person make for good communication when you write a good email. And that is they understand what you mean. There's no lack of clarity, and they're able to use that information to take action. So look for the principle and then figure out a way to apply it to the current challenge or situation, and you'll always be successful.
Well, there seems to be a running theme here, which is you can actually learn from your mistakes or your hardships or your problems and turn it into a success. You have a book Up, Down, or Sideways, and you tell a little bit about your personal story there. Maybe you could tell the listeners about that book.
That book came out of kind of a trifecta of crappy circumstances back during 2008 when the stock market was cratered, and at the same time I was diagnosed with cancer, and also was dealing with, as many were, if not most, a turn down in business. I was trying to come up with the right words. Those weren't very fancy words, but business was off. I'd lost a lot of money in the market because of some bad advice that I took. I always take responsibility for my decisions, even if it's based on somebody else's bad advice. And I was laying in bed watching all this happen, recovering from cancer surgery. Now, kind of fast forward the story, I'm cancer free, life is good. I had done so many things to kind of prepare for these three downturns that I found that I was kind of strangely optimistic and upbeat during that, because even though I'd lost some money, I diversified my investments so I wasn't wiped out. Even though my business was down, it wasn't down to the effect that many of my competitors and friends' businesses were down. And because of this kind of commitment to health, I'm not an uber health fanatic. I like bourbon and beer, so that would disqualify me. But I was really back on my exercise bike within 8 days of surgery with my doctor's blessing. So I wrote about, what are the things you should always be doing that'll help you succeed regardless of circumstance. When we think about change, we always focus on what we need to do differently. And certainly in my work with corporate clients, there are things that you do need to do differently. But there are always some underlying principles that if you practice them long enough, they build reserves. If you wait until you're sick to try to get healthy, you've got a real dilemma. Mm-hmm. If you stay healthy when you get sick, you don't get as sick, typically. And I know I'm painting with a broad brushstroke. If you start to save for a rainy day when it's raining, you're not going to save anything. You save for a rainy day while the sun is shining. And so these are some of the things I talk about. I always say there's what's important now, but there's also what always matters. And so in the book, I talk about the skills that I believe, the skills and mindsets. Those are really the two groups that I talk about. The skills and mindsets that if you practice them regularly will always benefit you over the long term. Now, I can't say that they'll pay off next Tuesday at noon or in 3 years at midnight. That's not the point of the book. It's not a get-rich-quick book. It's a stay successful always book, because we all face those upturns, downturns, and frankly, a lot of our lives, we're in between. We're just kind of moving sideways. So it's a book about how to deal with change by doing the things that you should never change.
Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the mindset and give us a sneak peek into some of those skills that you recommend.
Sure. Well, two mindsets that are really important. The first I call the scorekeeper's secret, and that says how you keep score determines how you play the game. A lot of very unhappy people I know are successful, but they're successful by somebody else's scorecard. They bought into a metric that was important maybe to what they thought was culture or society at large, or their parents. Maybe they went to college to become something their parents wanted them to be rather than what they wanted to be. So you need to know what's important to you, and that should be how you keep score. It shouldn't be, there's very few universals out there. You should know what your values are, so that if you decide you want to be a teacher in a third world country, you're not going to make a lot of money. So for God's sake, don't put monetary gain on your dashboard for how you measure your success in life. Put impact and gratification and service and monitor those things. Another mindset that's really helpful is what I call, the mindset of gratitude or gratefulness, because for years we've said that the opposite of negative thinking is positive thinking. And I think positive thinking is important, but I think the antidote to negative thinking isn't just changing your thinking, it's being grateful for what you've got.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I was facing a lot of downturns, I still had far more to be grateful for than I had to be ungrateful for.
Right.
You know, Sean Aker, I heard the technique from him and I've read it from another half dozen people in the happiness movement. But a really easy technique that I try to use is at the end of each day, I try to think about three good things that happened. Now, some days a lot of bad things happen. You know, you had some frustrations or traumas or difficulties, but there's always two or three things good that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't deny the bad. You know, I'm not a Pollyanna, you know, like just in my book, I talk about how much I despise that idea that, you know, don't ever read the newspapers. There's nothing positive in them. You know,
That's
that's
the
like the
truth.
ostrich effect. Well, if
Right.
you're, you know, and I know you understand real estate, you're an investor. If you don't read the newspapers, you're not going to make an informed decision when you decide to invest in a piece of property. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not one of these stick your head in the sand and talk happy talk people. But
Right.
at the same time, I do believe that we should always make sure we don't lose sight of what we have to be grateful for so that we become overwhelmed by our difficulties. So those are a couple of the mindsets. A quick skill set that's my favorite, I talked about it in my book, The Fred Factor, and I speak about it a lot, is creating value by replacing money with imagination, you know, outthinking your competition or outthinking your opportunities. Recently, I was in an airport in Milwaukee, flew in on a commuter plane, and you had to gate check your carry-ons. So they're not really carry-ons on a commuter plane; they're gate check bags.
Right.
And I've done that I don't know how many hundreds, if not thousands of times. But the guy that was bringing up the gate check bags very quickly put the handle up on everybody's bag. I'd never seen that before. Now, it took him an extra, you know, 1.5 seconds. I mean, this was not laborious or difficult, but that little extra effort made a big impression on me. And I thought, you know, here's a guy that if he decides he wants to do something else, if he brings that same mindset to another job, he'll probably be very successful
Mm-hmm.
because he understands how little things make a big difference to customers or to colleagues or to clients. And if you can be looking for the little things you can do that don't cost you a lot, but that are valued by the people you do them for, you'll be rewarded very well for that.
Well, when you mention the word outthink, I think, well, I have to be smarter or more innovative. But what I hear you saying is that outthinking is really thinking about the small things that have a big impact, which would include customer care or customer service.
While thinking is about thinking more than other people, and frankly, it's not that hard to do. Not because people are stupid, but because they mostly reactively think. You know, they get asked a question and they think about the answer. They don't think about a better question. And I think the ability to proactively think, to take even 15 minutes a day and think about your business and think about your life and think about what's important, that's something that I know people go days and weeks and sometimes months without doing. You know, they often get forced into doing it when a loved one passes or there's a tragedy or they are faced with a really big problem. But I'm talking about being proactive so that you can bring more thought to your business and life. Most business people are so busy doing, and even
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneurs, you know, they launch their business with a great idea, but then they become idea bankrupt because they don't make time to think about how to add value, create new business, create new customers, move into new markets.
So what I hear you saying is what separates the leaders of the pack from everybody else is that they are really giving additional attention to the details and how they can differentiate themselves and their businesses.
Well, certainly differentiation in a way that, and I always like to add, in a way that customers value. I see a lot of people trying to differentiate by doing weird, goofy stuff. My lights just went out in my office. That's the beauty of having a timed light switch. If I don't jump around, then
Do you have the clapper?
yeah, I wish. Actually, that would be more convenient because my light sensors in a place that I have to literally stand up and like
Well,
wave my
now
arms.
you have mood lighting.
I didn't want your if people are watching this, I didn't want them to think they had a sudden bout of glaucoma. You know, he was much brighter, not just intelligent, but much more well lit a moment ago. So it's about. I've talked myself way off track. So where
It's
was
all
I?
good.
All right.
You were talking about the not just um, people feel like that they have to think differently or create something, but your point was is that it has to be something that the client values.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. What a good listener you are. It was just a little test I concocted. If you're attracted. Well, I see people doing weird and goofy things. I always say if you wear a boa constrictor around your neck, that's different, but you're not going to have many customers that dig that, right? So the real test of differentiation is it valued? And if it's not valued, then it's not good differentiation.
Interesting. Is this something that you cover in Fred and the Fred Factor and Fred 2.0?
I probably do a little bit more in Fred 2.0. The Fred Factor is such a simple story about a postal carrier that I knew and still am friends with. He's retired now. About a guy that took a very simple job and did it in an extraordinary way. But he didn't do it because he was a strategic brander or differentiator or trying to become postmaster general. He did it just because he had a real heart for adding value and building relationships and being of greater service to his customers. Now, at the end of the day, all those things he did made him maybe one of the most famous postal carriers ever because the book sold over 1 million copies here in the United States and another 1 million internationally. But it wasn't what drove him. He wasn't a career strategist. He was just a guy that said, this is the way I want to live my life. These are the values that are important to me. And he likes people. And all of that came together in this wonderful story. By the way, your listeners can go to fredfactor.com and download the story, the first chapter for free.
Great.
It's called
Fabulous
First
resource.
Fred I Ever Met. And it tells the story about why Fred so impressed me and why we became friends.
Interesting. So I hear over and over again, it's paying attention, particularly to the people you're serving, if it's your clients or whatever, and attention to detail, where it makes a difference. That seems to be a pretty consistent theme for you. Would you agree?
It certainly is. I think we live in kind of a perpetual ADD environment. And I don't just mean we have ADD. Some people do. I probably have a little bit of it. But I think we've created this cultural ADD where we skim. My friend Dave Zock says, we skim along the surface. We're skimmers. And we rarely make time to go deeper and deal with the things that make us ultimately successful. I think the thing that people confuse is activity with accomplishment. Being busy is not the test of a good life. Building relationships and accomplishing things of significance often mean you have to become a little less busy, or at least you have to do a little, if not a lot less, of the superficial things. Even though I don't know Cal Newport, I ought to because I've been recommending his book. And as a guy that writes books, I'd much rather recommend my own. But Cal Newport just wrote a fabulous book I enjoyed so much called Deep Work, where he kind of addresses the cultural malaise of not, of being controlled by the ringing email chime or the incoming text and never having uninterrupted time to do truly deep work. And deep work requires attention. We've got to free up distraction. I've got a blog that will be coming out anytime now called Multitasking is a Myth and What to Do About It. I still hear people, even that claim to be time management and productivity experts, talk about how to multitask. You don't multitask. It's a myth. The research is conclusive. I didn't do the research, so you don't have to believe me. I have a dozen links of research papers that basically say task switching and multitasking are two different things. We think by doing 2 or 3 things at the same time, we're being more efficient. All we're doing is switching back and forth and taking longer to do each job less well. That's typically what happens when people try to multitask.
I had heard a story recently about even back in the day of Carnegie and Rockefeller, the thing that really differentiated them from the others is that they had the ability to really pick their top 1, 2, and 3 priorities and focus everything on that. And then our modern day example of that would be Warren Buffett. I understand he just takes one thing and goes with it to the detriment of everything else, but detriment, look at where he is today. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that, and I think that the challenge is when you're starting out, whether it's just out of high school or college or you're starting a business, you do it all. I mean,
Absolutely.
I did. I didn't have an assistant, even part-time assistant, for several years after I started my business. But the goal should always be to spend as much time doing what you do uniquely to generate the most value, and then over time, and this is the value of either using independent contractors or building an organization, is then to surround yourself with people that you can pay to do the things you don't do well or that don't behoove you to do well. I don't handle, my travel. I have an assistant that does that. Could I? Sure. But it would take away from the research that I do writing books and prepping for and delivering speeches. So over time, you want to generate enough revenue so that you can, and it's easier now, by the way, to use independent contractors. When I
Sure is.
started business there, the internet was, almost non-existent, and virtual assistants were non-existent back then. So look for ways to spend more time on what you do well that generates the most value, and then over time, delegate or farm out those things you either don't do well or don't like to do.
So I hear that technology is a double-edged sword here because one, we're skimming the surface, and then the other is technology is creating in effect a democratization of the workforce, right? You can outsource a lot more easily. You can bring in a virtual assistant. You could go to Fiverr to create a slide deck. There's a bunch of different things. How do leaders, what would you say is the biggest downside to technology, and how the leaders that you've worked with have managed technology to their benefit or to manage against the downside to help them do their job even better?
Well, technology is a tool, so the key is to learn to use the tool and not let the tool use you. I have a lot of tools at home, and none of them make any demands on me. My hammer doesn't require me to pick it up and use it to drive nails. However, if I need to drive a nail, I pick up the hammer. Ironically, a lot of execs seem to have adapted an idea where the technology makes them decide what to do and how to do it. The ultimate question is what you're trying to achieve, and then whether or not a particular technology, and there are many that will assist, will help you achieve those goals. One of the challenges that I wrote about recently is that leaders are kind of anxious about big data. Well, big data provides insights, but ultimately you have to act on the insights. It's the difference between knowing something and using the information. There are so many people that understand big data better than me or most of the execs that I work with. I always say make sure, if it's important to you, that you either find a consultant or you have someone on your team that can guide you and give you the upsides and downsides and let you know what the benefits are and what the cost would be to using big data.
Well, I think what really differentiates people is the ability to curate information. So to cull from the massive amount of information that comes at us every day, what's most pertinent, what's most important to your business and how you're looking to compete and differentiate yourself.
Well, the problem with curation is it can prevent creation. If
Yeah.
you only curate, you're always repurposing or using secondary information. Ultimately, the best leaders create; they don't just curate.
Yeah.
Let's pause while I cough. Excuse me. That's really weird. Just right out of the blue, I'm attacked.
The lights, the coffee.
I bet that's not vodka. That might help.
You know what? It's all just life happening.
I was going to say, boy, talk about informal. Yeah, he coughed. He sat in the dark. If he passes out, we'll know he's really comfortable.
Well, you know what? Here's an example of disruptive environment, right? Things are happening.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me something about tell me your thoughts about disruption. You just wrote a blog recently about it.
I talk about the fact that there's, two kinds of people, the disruptors and the disrupted, and it's better to disrupt yourself than to let someone else do it. Typically, we become so comfortable doing what we've always done that we don't change until we have to, and by the time we have to, it's often too late, or at least there's no competitive advantage left in that. I think there are a lot of things in our lives that if we don't disrupt them first, either in the way of ideas or habits or people, they'll come back to disrupt us. An employee that's underperforming, that we don't make time to either coach or get rid of, ultimately costs us a great deal of money and becomes disruptive when some kind of major mistake is made or you reach some kind of cataclysmic intersection with that employee and their behavior. Or an idea that used to work 5 years ago beautifully and it's working really pitifully now, we keep doing because it used to work, and we need to disrupt that idea by disrupting our thinking. So I think basically, what leaders are called to do is find the ideas and the people on their teams that need to be disrupted, not out of any malicious intent, but for the betterment of the organization. I had an accountant for many years. The only reason he's not my accountant today is he retired. I knew him longer than I've known my wife. And one of the things I so admired about Rick is he would call me on stupid stuff that I either had done or didn't do. I mean, he'd be tough love, you know. He'd talk about some, tax strategy that I'd let slide, and through him, he disrupted me enough that I changed. That's what disruption does. It creates good change. It unsettles people so they're not complacent and instead they're making progress.
So disruption is another word for progress. It's just not managing the chaos.
Well, again, disruption is the tool and progress is the benefit.
So we talk about a bunch of things today. If you were to give leaders one key word of advice, like what would that be?
I think one of the things that makes any leader more effective is not just when he or she is focused, but when they create shared focus with their team. It means knowing what's really important, having a sense of priority, and then sitting down with each member of your team to make sure they're not wasting time each day doing things of low value that they may mistakenly think are important, and they're doing the important work that you hire them to do. There'll always be interruptions and distractions, but it's the ability to spend at least 60 to 80% of our days on the things that really matter. That's what produces results for leaders and their teams.
How do people figure that out? I mean, I think many people go about their day just checking things off the list, thinking that's what productivity is. But how do you really source into what is the most important thing? What is the most productive thing?
Well, I call them MVP activities, most valuable and profitable activities. And it begins with this question. You know, the 188 things you probably will do today, what are the 6 or 8 things that give you the biggest payback on your investment of time and expertise? In other words, you got time, you got expertise. And if you're a leader, you have the time and expertise of your team. Those are the raw ingredients. If you're spending your time and expertise on filling out paperwork, even if that paperwork is necessary, you're not creating value. That is a low value activity. May need to be done, but that's not where you should focus your energy. In my business, I have 4 MVP activities, and one is creating, whether it's in the written word or the spoken word, whether it's developing material. If I'm not creating every day, I can get really wrapped up in a lot of low priority activities that will keep me busy, but won't allow me to accomplish much.
And you said there were 4. What are the other 3?
Well, I believe relationship building with clients and colleagues is important. Also, I put relationship building, creating, delivering, which is about actually being on stage, and then producing. And that is creating is coming up with the idea and then turning that idea into a book, a blog, an article, a podcast, a seminar, a speech. That's the creating part. So the relationship building, the creating, the producing, and the delivering. Those are the 4 things that give me, those are my 4 most valuable and profitable activities.
And they bring the most value to your clients as well.
Exactly.
So you've given me a lot of information today, and the listeners, tell me of everything that you've talked about and everything about your career, what are you most proud of? What's your greatest accomplishment?
You know, I think I'm most proud of my sons. I have a 15 and 18-year-old, and I'm very proud of them. I think the most important job I have is raising them with my wife Darla. How they turn out will be the ultimate reflection on whether I had a clue or not about character, integrity, leadership, service, and all the things that I talk about. You know, they're kind of my most intensive mini laboratory at home, and so I place a great value on trying to raise those 2 to be men of integrity. Beyond that, I would say the thing that gratifies me the most is when I get some feedback from a reader or a listener who says they were able to use an idea to improve their business or their life. I don't change their life, they change their life. I don't change their business, they change their business. But I'm really delighted to be part of the value chain that can give them both the ideas and the impetus to apply those ideas so that when they do, their lives or their businesses are better for it.
Right. And I think that's why you and I do what we do, is to provide them with the tools and the ideas so that they can succeed in life, which is why we're here today with this podcast as well.
Indeed. Now, did you want to ask me about my ambition quote?
Well, first I want to ask you this. You
Ah,
mentioned your boys.
yes.
What advice would you give to your boys about succeeding in the world? And I know everybody has a different ambition, so we will get to that ambition quote. But what's that key piece of advice for the upcoming generation about how to be in their fullness and succeed in the world? And I know success is different for different people.
Right. Well, I would give similar advice to my sons I gave to my younger brother. I have a brother that's 5 years younger than me, wildly successful restaurant operator, real estate broker. But when he graduated from high school, I wrote in his graduation card, do whatever you do better than anybody else that does it. Now, that doesn't mean that we always are able to, but that's always our aspiration. I always say I don't control a lot, but the one thing I control is how hard I work. So I would say to my sons, as I said to my brother, whatever you choose to do, obviously I hope you choose to do something that you enjoy, because it's a lot easier to work hard at what you enjoy doing than it is to work hard at what you hate.
Yeah.
But once you find out what it is, just make it your goal to do it better than anybody else that does it. And generally, that means working a little bit longer and a little bit harder than other people are willing to work.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science, but it sure isn't easy.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us your ambition quote, tell us a little bit also how it applies to you personally.
I'm a big believer in ambition. I'm a capitalist. I believe in free enterprise, and also believe we live in an age where we have to kind of defend that concept. But I don't want to go too far afield. I'll say this. As much as I like ambition, never confuse ambition with leadership. Ambition benefits you, but leadership benefits the greater good. I might be ambitious and want to make a lot of money, but it's not real leadership until I'm able to use that money to benefit others. I might want to rise in my organization and assume a higher pay level and a new title. But if I haven't helped my organization become better, or the people that I work with and lead to become better, then that's been an act of ambition, not an act of leadership. In other words, true leadership always benefits the greater good. And ambition by itself gets pretty boring after a while. The old cliche that, when you're the person who's wrapped up in him or herself makes a very small package. When we meet people who are driven simply by personal ambition rather than the greater good, we find that those people often make very small packages.
Absolutely. And I think, to your point, I think there's a big assumption that ambition equals making more money or getting a better, higher title. But you mentioned at the beginning of our interview about the woman who does social work, and that maybe her ambition is about serving the community and it's not about money. Or for an artist, it could be about creating an amazing piece of work, but that it inspires others as well. So I think ambition could take all different forms.
Indeed, it's fuel to achieve what it is we set out to achieve. And so like I said, I'm a big fan of ambition. Nobody becomes great without ambition, but at some point, the ambition for self should be coupled with an ambition for the greater good.
Now, you had already mentioned one other book that you have enjoyed lately, and can you mention that again to our listeners?
Sure. Deep Work by Cal Newport.
Okay, well, we'll make a note of that in the show notes for this show that will be included on the website. Are there any other resources that you would recommend to my listeners?
Well, I hope they'll visit my website. I have a lot of free resources. They don't have to buy anything. If they want to buy something, I'm totally giddy with that. I mean, I'm most days I'm not a nonprofit. Bad weeks sometimes, But I would say if they like the ideas you and I talked about today, go to marksanborn.com. I've written 5 books. The Fred Factor has had great success because it's given people simple tools and a narrative to help them turn ordinary into extraordinary. Somebody says to me, what book should I start with? It's not my best written book. I hope I've become better as I've written more and more books, but it might be my most effective book at giving people tools and the drive they need to become extraordinary.
And also on your website, you have some videos of you speaking as well, and I think the listeners would benefit from
Boatloads, yeah,
watching those.
boatloads of free videos, 70 or so free video. And they can also access four other of my pals. We call ourselves the Five Friends, oddly.
I love that podcast. That is so fun.
Yeah, Larry Winget, Scott McCain, Randy Pennington, Joe Calloway, and myself. And we talk about usually business related things or success related things. And sometimes we just go off on a tangent and have a wild hair and do something totally unredeeming and discuss bourbon. But I would encourage your listeners to check out the Five Friends as well.
And you're all speakers, is that correct?
Speakers, consultants, authors, but we're all kind of in the same genre. Sometimes we're friendly competitors, but we often we're very different in our approaches, so we don't compete nearly as much as we cooperate and collaborate.
Well, I think that's the great thing about the speaking world is most people like to refer each other because we all have our own expertise and our own way we can be in service to the world, if you will.
Indeed.
So while we're talking about that, the show is really about spreading big ideas from ambitious leaders. Is there anybody that you would recommend to be a guest on this show?
Well, I just talked about four of them.
Okay.
So the other four-fifths of the Five Friends, and if you tell them I recommended them, I'm pretty sure they'll agree to be on the show.
Check, check, and check. Hopefully you can make an introduction for me. I would love
I'll
to
be
have
glad
you
to
on.
do that.
Okay, well, you can find links to Mark's website and the resources that he mentioned by going to marksanborn.com. And if you like this episode, you could check it out at www.theambitionprojectshow.com, where you could find links to all the things we mentioned here in this interview. Also, you could find it on iTunes at The Ambition Project Show. So, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show.
And for the listeners, stay ambitious, get out there and make the world a better place. All right. Thanks, Mark.
You're so photogenic.